everyone, welcome to the next PPF webinar with Bob Duffy. We're looking at cash flow modeling in the enterprise with Power BI. So just kind of very brief intro. So Power Platform Finance, we've been running virtually since March, since Easter time this year. We've run, I think, 15 or 16 webinars on different topics, so dynamics, Power Platform integration, looking at some of the vendors and add-ons and integrations from a finance perspective. So things like Zebra BI, ValQ, Actoris, Power One BI, they've all come and done some webinars for us. So as just saying before we started recording, really helped to kind of open my eyes at least as well about how Power BI can be used in the finance space and beyond. So how it can be extended. So, you know, we're looking next year, we're happy to run some physical events as of when we're allowed to, but also even virtually as well. If you have any ideas and things you'd like to share or examples that you're working on that you'd like to see how you can apply the Power Platform technology stack to, then yeah, please reach out and let's start thinking about how we can do some of those, I think, next year as well. It's just some webinars. So yeah, it's run by myself. So I'm principal consultant at Altius and Avanade. So Altius is now part of Avanade. I'm a chartered accountant by background. I've been working with Power BI for the last few years, kind of in, you know, mainly in looking at obviously report development, but also some of the governance side of it and how it's deployed in large organizations. So Chris, do you want to introduce yourself? Chris is here as well on the call. Chris, are you there?
Mate, not gone for bio break.
Okay, sure, no worries. Cool. Okay, yeah. So Chris is in the call as well. He works with me at LTS, also kind of from finance background and very, very good with kind of Power BI and stuff like that as well. And my friend Devine, who's, I'm not sure if he's on the call, but he's also involved in helping to run this as well. So I work with Devine also. We run Learn Data Insights, which is a site where we're looking to help people prepare for exams like Power BI DA100 and the Python exam with quizzes and things like that.
And we also participate in hackathons.
Oh yeah, hackathons. Yeah, we did a project hackathon this weekend as well. So the project data analytics community is also really strong. So and actually it's quite interesting because it's quite integrated with finance as well. So you've got finance, you've got project, it's like construction projects, and you know there's project finance aspects to that as well. So there's lots of interesting sectors and applications of Power BI. And I think for me, that's where Power BI really becomes interesting, where it really comes to life when you start applying it to a specific sector or industry or area, because that's where you're then delivering real business value. As much as I like the kind of general Power BI things on cocktails and general things on public data, I think applying it to some really interesting industry stuff is also really good. So on powerplatformfinance.com, I did realize actually when I went into it today that I hadn't published the updated version of the site, so apologies for that, but I've just done that now and put on Chris Huntingford's last session, which was on there. So it's on the YouTube channel as well, obviously. So last webinar was with Chris, where he ran through the whole of Dynamics. It's really engaging, interesting session. So if you haven't seen it already, then I'd encourage you to go and watch that session and really kind of, again, open your eyes on what Dynamics could be used for and CDS and all of these technologies, how they all fit together. As Chris describes it, they're all kind of Lego blocks in a solution that can fit together in that way. So next, I'll say if you could also, if this is the URL for feedback, we've had about 50 responses so far. These really do help the presenters and really help us to think about how to best serve the Power Platform Finance community. So do please take a few minutes to fill these in. Link is there and I'll put it in the chat. And then up next, we've got Mark Wilcock, and Mark is actually on the call today. So Mark, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit and tell us about what you're going to be covering next time?
Yeah, I will do quickly. So in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be talking about all sorts of kind of Power BI modeling techniques that I find kind of crop up in finance. For example, there's the kind of double aggregation issue. For example, we've got to take trades, we've got to aggregate them at a currency pair level, and then we've got to net out the ones that have a negative exposure. It's often in regular reporting. So about 3 or 4 things: do an example, show the problem and show a solution, and discuss pros and cons.
Great. So yes, we've got some financial services kind of stuff in there as well, which is really interesting, like trading and things like that. So I've seen Mark present loads of times, and he's absolutely excellent. So really looking forward to that. Thanks again for Mark for doing that. And then yeah, I think now we're over to Bob for your session. So Bob.
Okay, is that up there? Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so just to check everyone's in the right kind of session. So we're going through modeling cash flow, and I'm looking at the kind of larger enterprise type of structure. So the sort of data that you like to get out of an ERP or kind of maybe a accounts package, I guess. And and what are the challenges of producing a cash flow, right? So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Bob. As I said, I've been around the sort of database sector in Ireland and the analytics sector for a long time. I think about 30 years at this point, right? I'm a certified SQL architect, or what used to be an MCA or a SQL Ranger, a certified master, an MVP, and an analysis services maestro. And then my sort of day job is I work as a data architect, helping large scale enterprises implement data warehouses and business intelligence on top of platforms like analysis services and Power BI. So obviously this kind of talk is loosely from my experience in the finance kind of sector, helping customers get their core finance reporting, sort of GL type stuff, to come alive in sort of Power BI from whatever ERP they've got, SAP, M3 and so forth. Okay, so as an agenda, I'll briefly show something that hopefully looks familiar to most people, what a typical set of financial tables might kind of look like if you're lucky. Now this is kind of almost a part two, because really before you can do cash flow, you kind of need to have profit and loss in the balance sheet. So I'm just going to recap on 4 fundamental concepts that we covered at previous talks about the profit and loss on the balance sheet. I think I'm going to have a video online from SQL Bits about that, but I'm going to recap them in this kind of session. So just in case anyone it's completely new, and then we'll look at the new stuff that has to be enhanced to produce the cash flow, and how to implement things like a smooth kind of reconciliation. And the last thing is really how to bring it alive in Excel at the same time, so you can cohabit and flip between Power BI and Excel with no loss in functionality or format or layout or anything like that. Okay. One key thing about this talk is no fancy data viz here, right? Although it's in kind of Power BI, I'm talking about modeling pro forma financial reports. They're very strict in format. What we generally do is we adhere exactly to how the accountants want them presented, line by line, right? We then add analytics around them to do drill through, drill across, kind of make it context kind of sensitive. But we're not going to be covering too much of the visualization aspects. It's more about the core sort of modeling aspects here, right? So starting off, on screen, you've got what hopefully people would recognize as a general ledger star schema that you can almost suck out of most ERPs, right? So most ERPs will give you a transactional file, which I've called sort of general ledger here. It'll have an amount on it, and it'll have a bunch of keys on it that will relate to the dimensionality of the general ledger, which is different by customer. So keys could be their product group, their customer, their company hierarchy. There's lots of different keys that they might have on their general ledger. They will always have a chart of accounts, right? So there'll always be an account key, or sometimes called a general ledger code, that will have a description of the account and its account type, like is it expense, is it liability? It usually has a 4-digit code, and accountants are very fastidious about how those codes are allocated. Kind of like IP ranges, so 1,200 could be sales and 1,201 could be third-party sales or something like that. Okay, so that's the sort of structure that we're going to work with today. Now this is very simplified in that I've just got one fact table here. Sorry, is there a question there?
So I think it was just someone unmuted. I just muted them.
Oh, okay, yeah. So this is a very simplified view because it's just one kind of fact kind of table there, right? Usually there's multiple tables because you might have a separate budget table. You're probably going to have a separate balance table if it's a large ERP, but I'm just going to stick with the single table approach here, right? So there's an example of the tables. And we're going to recap the 4 common problems that we'd have to resolve just to at least get to a profit and loss on the balance sheet, right? Now, the most basic of basics is the signage or the unary operator are dealing with the credit and debit, right? So basically, when you suck all of your sort of data out, if you just naively bring it into Power BI and sort of sum it up, you might be able to get something that looks like a profit and loss out of the chart accounts, but you probably find the numbers are going to be a bit kind of messed up. So if you look at this one, I've got 1.6 million sales, I've got about 700K in expenses. So common sense and high school maths tell me that sort of profit is going to be, you know, sales kind of minus expenses, but it's actually added them up, right? Because so what I kind of want is my expenses to be negative or some way to kind of handle that. So there's a few different ways of doing that. 80% of people tend to do it in DAX, right? So they write an if statement based on the expense type. We don't tend to do that. I try and push as much down into the data model to make for a more performant report. So we do it at ETL time, which in the Power BI world is in Power Query or the M language. So just as an example here, I've added a step into the Power Query that's importing it, and I've just got an if statement in there, which is adding a calculated column and saying if the account type is expenditure, well, it would be sort of liability is going to be negative as well. Put it as -1, otherwise stick it as 1, right? So that then leads you to a situation where the numbers add up, right? And that's very common across a lot of financial reports. The numbers come in as negative, but you want them to show them on the report as positive, or vice versa, right? So that's one of the tricks in order to do that. Get it stored in a way that it will naturally add up, okay? I don't think I'll bother showing a demo of that because I think everyone can appreciate how you do that in the Power Query, hopefully. Right, 2, this is really the meat of how we do financial reports differently than most other people I meet, right? The concepts of how you deal with dynamic operators and what I call the many-to-many bridge table, right? If we take a look at a profit and loss, right? So I'm just going to bring on screen a sample kind of profit and loss. So if everyone can see on screen, we've got gross sales, and then we've got a few items underneath that are the different types of sales. So that's a hierarchy, and then we've got a few other items. What you'll notice is some of these items are natural sums of account codes, right? So we might have a couple of GL codes or trade sales. Some of them, if you look at net invoice sales, that's effectively gross sales plus less kind of discounts. So it's a running sum. Returns and adjustments is a sum of the account codes, but net sales is another running sum, or it could be a custom sum of the previous 2 combined. So you've got some of your elements on your report or your lines are sums, some are running sums, and some are kind of custom sums of some of the other ones. So all 3 types of operators have got to be counted for. So what we do is we soft code this as metadata. Okay, so sitting above the chart of accounts, you'll have a reporting table that defines the lines of the report. Okay, so, and that has got to account for the fact there's going to be different types of lines. Some are basic sums where it's just summing up account codes. Some are running sums, and some is some sort of custom roll up or a subtotal of some sort. So on screen, you will see the sort of metadata table that we would keep in, that we would load into Power BI, right? If it was a data warehouse project, it would sit in a SQL table. If it was a pure Power BI sort of project, it might be a spreadsheet with the rules in them, right? So you can see for every line on the report, we define the operator, what heading it is going to go in, and what the wording of the report section is going to be, and a unique line number for that type of report. Once we've done that, we then create this many-to-many table that maps the different relationships. And I'll show an example of how that works. So our financial report that we use is effectively going to dip into the chart of accounts, and different lines on the report are going to use different GL codes, but it's a many-to-many map, right? Now, I'll just show how that might work, because it's quite hard to visualize that, right? So if we look at our data structures, here's our chart of accounts, which is the sort of dim account. I've got 4 accounts: internet sales, dealer sales, trade sales, and expenses, and they'll have a GL code or an account code. I want on my profit and loss to have 5 lines, right? 1 and 2 are going to be sums, but customer sales is going to be internet sales plus kind of dealer sales. So it's going to group those, right? Then I want trade sales, then I want a running sum, then I want expenses, and then I want a running sum of those, right? So what I do is we define this rules spreadsheet that maps from the report lines, okay, into ranges of account numbers from and to. So we see the first one, which is customer sales, is from account number 1120 to account number 1200. So I can see that's going to cover my first 2 accounts. Okay. Now the end result, we get some data engineering magic, and we want to get this type of many-to-many table. So we know report number line 1 is account key 1 and 2, which is internet sales plus kind of dealer sales. 2 is going to be account key 3, which is trade sales. But 3, which is a running sum, is going to be 1, 2, and 3. Okay. So once we've got that, all of the calculations are done by what we call the storage engine in Power BI, which is many times faster than the formula engine, right? So we're not doing any runtime calculations. It's all just handled by the sort of data model, and that gives us a lot of performance boost, but it obviously gives us a bit more robustness to it. So let's, here's an example of the actual rules that I used, and then we'll dive into Power BI and actually have a look at how we built that bridge table, okay? Now, so here's our first rules table that defines the lines on the profit and loss, right? So here's all the lines on the kind of profit and loss, what their headings are, what their operator is. And then here's the mapping table that says for each report, what are the account codes on the chart of accounts, like from and to ranges, right? I could have multiple lines as well. So see, administration is a whole collection of different kind of ranges. Okay, so let's actually see what that would look like if I were to build that kind of many-to-many table. I go into my transform kind of data. Here I have my account. Now the source for all of this kind of data, which I'll put online, is just spreadsheets and CSV files. So I'll just show you the source of data. This is a source of data. So I've got a spreadsheet for each, you know, here's my chart of accounts, and here are my rules kind of tables. I've got a calendar, an organization, and these are my transactions that I've assumably exported out of the ERP. Okay. Now, I've taken the account rules spreadsheet and I've created these hidden sheets here, right? Now, what you can do in Power Query is you can create tables which are refreshed, but they aren't loaded into the report. So they're not visible by the sort of data model. They're just used for the data engineering aspects of the ETL, right? And this first one is going to come from this spreadsheet called account range rules. It just simply loads that table, and we end up with a simple table. For this report, this is the from and the to account number. And from there, we convert that from and to range into the actual account keys that are between those two ranges, right? Now, this is something which is a little bit harder to do in Power Query than it is in T-SQL. So for those of you who are familiar with kind of SQL Server and T-SQL, it has a between clause, right? In Power Query, what you can do is you can start with your source, you can add on a custom column, and you can make that a list to say the list goes from ... to, okay? So I can create a column that is a list from that to that, and then you can expand that and it will enumerate everything that comes between that. So it's a way of expanding it. Then I rename that. I join that back to the chart of accounts to find all the valid ones, because a lot of these account codes probably aren't even used, okay? And then from there, I now have the accounts that fall within that range if there are some, and so forth. And the end result is I get this lovely many-to-many table that says for this report line, these are the account keys that match that. So that basically takes care of my sum, my very basic thing, right? Then for a running sum, I do the exact same thing, but for the running sum, the first report number is going to be hard coded at 1. I'm always going from 1, right? And I'm going from 1, the child number is going to be from 1 to the current line number. And then what I do is I then filter out ones that aren't kind of running sums. I expand out the list. I join that list back to the chart of accounts, and I end up at the end of the day with effectively a many-to-many type of table that will map between the report and the account key. And the last one is the custom one. So where I've just said, well, this is a sum, but it's this one plus kind of this one, the exact same procedure. I effectively figure out how they're going to be joined. So if we go back to the account range here, you'll see, let's go to the profit and loss. You'll see here's one example of a custom sum. I'm saying this cost of sales is equal to this plus this, because they're grouped by this cost of sales calculation label, which is what the kind of heading is there. So what I do is I find all of the elements that have that, join that, and make that many-to-many kind of table. And then when I do my final report map, that is just the appending all three onto themselves. Okay, so that's that. Once I have that, I then have this report account map table. Okay, I'm slightly messed up because it should only have 3 kind of columns in there. So I think one of them had a couple of extra columns that shouldn't have been there. And now all of the profit and loss renders without having to do much in the calculation. So if you look at my GL amount, it's just really a sum. That's all it is. There's no fancy DAX or formulas. The only thing I do have to do is AdventureWorks has actual budget and forecast glued into the same kind of table, which is very rare. So I do have to filter out to say, hey, I'm only interested in the actual. So there's a tiny bit of DAX, right? But there's no complex kind of DAX. It's just really sum. So what I get from that is performance, but I also get flexibility of layout. If the financial accountants say, well, can we have something else as an extra line in my P&L? I go to my rules table. I say, right, I want to add, well, I wouldn't want to add something after the profit after tax, but I might add something to the middle of the one and say, right, I want to add a new line. This is what I'm going to call it. This is what its heading is going to be. This is its type of calculation. Is it a sum? Is it a running sum? Is it a custom aggregate, right? Once I've done that, I just hit the refresh button in kind of Power BI and bang, it will reload all of my rules and it'll render my profit and loss, okay? So that's the key concept to understand, that for the profit and loss and the balance sheet, the business of the sums versus running sum versus custom aggregates that are very common on financial reports, we implement by this map table or this many-to-many kind of table. And once we have that, we can also implement the exact same thing for the balance sheet. Okay, now the only difference between the profit and loss on the balance sheet, the many-to-many concept is exactly the same, but how we calculate it is slightly different. The profit and loss is just going to be the sum of the transactions for that period, but the balance sheet, we're generally talking about closing balance, right? So what you might have is some DAX to do the closing balance. So here's an example. Now, it varies by project. Some of our customers will actually have a snapshot kind of table where they have, well, at this point in time, this is what the sort of balance should be. Smaller systems might actually make you sum up over time to get to the balance, right? And that's kind of what AdventureWorks does. You can see that what I'm doing here in the DAX to get the closing balance, I'm getting what the max fiscal period is, and then I'm calculating the sum of the kind of GL amount over all of time, but making sure I've changed the filter criteria to just be less than or equal to whatever the variable is here. So that's a standard design pattern for closing balance that you could see on there. And you can now see once I do that, I can get opening balance, movement, and closing balance, which is really most balance sheets would then just show the closing balance. Okay, so that's a basic example of how to render these profit and loss and kind of balance sheet. Okay, now one of the things you'll notice about the report is it's hierarchical, right? So what you've got is gross sales has two things under it, right? Now, Power BI is horrible out of the box at handling what we call ragged hierarchies, where there's a header and a subheader, and some of them are one level and some of them are two level. It doesn't really handle that very well, right? So what we have is we have to use a little bit of DAX magic to clean it up, so we avoid these blanks appearing on the report, because the accountant's going to be very fussy. They're not going to accept like blanks in the middle of the report, right? So let's just flip back to the document. So if you look at the profit and loss, is probably a better example, right? If you zoom in here, you'll see gross sales is two levels, but discounts is only one. But I don't have a second line. Now that doesn't happen by magic, that not showing the second line, right? What I do, and there's lots of ways of doing this. I've got some links at the end of the talk that go into the various ways of doing this. In this particular example, I'm probably doing it the oldest way, right? What we do is on the financial report, I create this measure called report scope. And what I do is I see is in scope is a new function that tells me if the report section has been selected on the report or not. Okay. And what I do is if it has been selected, I count the number of items underneath it, underneath the heading. And if there's only one, right, or if it's greater than one, I set it to true, meaning show it. And if it's less than one, I set it to null or null, kind of meaning hide it. And what I then do is on my GL amount that I show on my profit and loss, just go to my general ledger, my GL amount, you'll see the final part of the calculation, I multiply it by the report scope. Now, it's very hacky. In the old analysis services days, the engine naturally did this because there's a flag to support kind of ragged hierarchies. That feature isn't fully implemented yet. There are ways of doing it by hacking in tools that I'm not sure on the supportability. So we use this sort of DAX approach. I'll show you what happens when I take off that extra helper function. I get this type of effect where you see the net invoice sales appears on two lines, which probably isn't what you're looking for visually. Yeah. So I'll stick that back on. We deal with ragged hierarchies to make them look kind of nicer, basically, and more exactly like the pro forma format that we're actually given. You know, this absolutely has to be on this line. Right, that's a very quick. I had like an hour presentation on the profit and loss and balance sheet before, right? But those are the four kind of fundamental concepts I want to get through, because yes, we talked about the opening balance and the closing balance formulas for the balance sheet. Once we've learned those four lessons, we can apply that to now look at the cash flow, right? Now, the cash flow is slightly more complex than the profit and loss and the balance sheet, because it's kind of like a hybrid between them, right? So what we're going to do on the cash flow, now, one thing to bear in mind is we never mandate the format of the cash flow, right? I mean, I arrive on a project, there's teams of financial accountants who are going to be telling me how the cash flow is kind of laid out. There's rough rules, but every customer tends to have slightly different lines and headings, and it's roughly the same gist, but it's never identical, right? The rough gist is the first line is generally one of your profit elements, right? Now I say one of, because if you look at the profit and loss, there's multiple definitions of profit. You've got profit before interest and tax, profit after tax. You've got EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax and amortization, and various other flavors of profit, right? So they'll take one of those kind of flavors, they'll add back on items that weren't really cash movements. So depreciation and goodwill, you know, that's kind of invisible cash, right? And then they'll account for changes in what you call working net sort of capital, inventory, creditors, and debtors, right? And what we're doing is we're seeing how cash is flowing basically in the company, right? Because you could be making a profit of €1 million, but if your debtors have gone up by €1 million, you're not going to have any cash in the bank, right? Because it's all with sort of people who owe you kind of money. And if you had to buy stuff for your inventory in order to sell that €1 million, you're going to have a negative bank account at this point. And that's really the whole point of the cash flow, is the difference between what you've earned in your profit and loss and what is sitting in your cash account on your sort of balance sheet. So we're going to have all of those kind of differences. We might account for capital expenditure, like, you know, actually I've bought an asset, so there's money come out of my bank, and that's going to give us the operating cash flow. We then might have other ways that money has flowed in and out of the bank account. For example, investments. We could have bought property and we're getting investment rental income. I mean, that's not really our operating income, right? So that's generally below the line, yeah? So lots of other things. And then at the very end, we might do a reconciliation where we say, well, let's take the opening balance of our bank account, let's take the final figure from the cash flow of all the movements, add that on, and that should equal the amount of cash that we have in our cash account at the end of the month. Let's flip over to the balance sheet and see what the closing balance is. Are they the kind of same? And generally what happens, if there's a problem in the accounting system where someone has put something in the wrong account code or they haven't set up the kind of mappings correctly, it won't reconcile, right? So there's a cottage industry in finding out why it doesn't reconcile, fixing the problem and making sure that it doesn't happen again, right? So that's the basis of the cash flow. What you'll see is different is some of the figures are coming from the profit and loss and some are coming from the balance sheet. We're not summing them up from the chart of accounts, we're summing them up from other reports. So the cash flow for me is like a report on top of other reports. It's not necessarily from the basic chart of accounts, because I don't fancy having to figure out the profit. For example, we look at the profit. I've already calculated that on the profit and loss. I don't fancy having to write a formula to recalculate that from scratch, because I might make a mistake and it could be different, right? So I want to take the actual figure from the profit and loss as my first line. Other items, such as these, I want to take these from my balance sheet. Okay. So what we do to do that is we use a slight extension to the metadata that I showed you, right? So if we look at the spreadsheets that we set up to do the profit and loss on the balance sheet, bring up my spreadsheets. So here's a spreadsheet that defines the line on all the reports. So we see for the profit and loss, we had this, and it's sum, running sum, and a custom calculation. For the cash flow, we have a new operator called link. And what this is saying is link this line here to a line on another report. And we're saying link this to the profit and loss line 18, right? Now, in some of our systems, we have the name of the account. In some, we have the report number. In this particular one, it's got the line kind of number, right? So just to show you this, if I show you what line 18 is, go to profit and loss, and line 18, profit before interest and tax, okay? And then we define the other operators. I'm going to want to do a subtotal here, but the problem is the subtotal could contain items that are from the profit and loss or the balance sheet. So this time we use what I call a DAX kind of subtotal, where we're going to do it on the report in real time and not as part of the data model. So we have these links. We have a link group, right? So this particular thing, movement in or purchase of fixed assets, I want to go to a whole group in the balance sheet, not an individual section. I want to go to the whole group. So just to show you this, if we look at the balance sheet, I want to look at all of non-current assets, not just any one, and say, well, that's my movement in fixed assets, right? So I'm being kind of lazy, kind of rather than say that and that and that, I'm just saying everything in this group. Okay. That's just an example of group link. And then towards the end of the report, I want to use the opening balance from this line in the balance sheet and the closing balance from that line in the kind of balance sheet. And then I've got a custom calculation for the reconciliation at the end. So all of these combined will give me this cash flow here with all of these items coming from different parts of the report. Let's just do this for 1 month, December, say, right? So the way that we implement this is I create hidden measures. Now, I'm actually showing them here by just calling them internal, right? To create the link amount, we have some DAX function that puts in a variable what the metadata was. I need this line on this report, and then I just use a calculate to change the filter context to be the previous line on the previous report, which could be take me line 18 from the sort of profit and loss, right? So once I've done that, that then can render the first line and the second and the third line. The subtotal, I've got one called DAX subtotal. This is the sort of DAX to do a subtotal. So within the same hierarchy, I use all except to say I want to go over the whole of the report except for the heading. So what that means is I'm setting the filter context to stick, just within the heading, not within the whole of the report, right? And then once within that heading, I'm going to do a sumx to iterate over all of the items and sum them up. And that's a subtotal, right? So that's basically what I'm doing. See, I'm doing a sumx, iterating over the line items, and one at a time, I'm summing them up. When I come to the movement in working capital, I've got a link opening balance and a link closing balance, and so forth. So once I've done all the individual ones, all I then do is for the cash flow measure that I use, I just have a switch statement that says, depending on the operator that is associated with this line, if it's a link, use the link amount. If it's an open balance, use that. If it's closing balance, use that, and so forth. So using this technique, we can have a dynamic rules-based thing where different lines have different types of data coming into them. Some of them are coming from the profit and loss. Some of them are coming from the balance sheet. Some of them are movement on the balance sheet. Some of them are opening balances, some of them are closing balance. Okay. And once we do that, we get this implementation here where I can now slice and dice. I can add on my sort of visualizations, and I've now got my cash flow report. For example, here's a waterfall chart on the right side. So I can see that most of my movement in cash is because of a massive change in debtors, right? So a lot of people have paid this month, right? But I've also bought a lot of fixed assets as well. So I can see, you know, I'm ending up at that much cash, and that's how I ended up that point, okay? And if I cross-reference back to the balance sheet, I would see this would correspond, if I had the same filter criteria, with the amount of the cash received there, right? So that'd be the cash balance as such, right? So that's the concept there. Behind that, it takes a little bit of getting used to how to define this metadata in the account range, and then how to write the measures to obviously do the kind of filtering. So I do have a link where this example that I've kind of made up that has all three of them. It's got the profit and loss, a balance sheet, and a cash flow. Is all in there, including all the formulas. So if you want to look through all the formulas to see, oh, you know, how do you do that link, you know, how do you do that link group, it's all in there type thing. And what I've done is I've just hidden them inside this internal group there. Okay. One thing that I found super useful about this kind of metadata approach is when I first started doing financial reporting, I was quite naive in that I thought profit and loss is only one thing, right? You know, there's only one profit and loss for a company. And then as I started working for larger companies, I realized that different teams have different profit and losses. Like the manufacturing team considers what their operating expenses are differently than the company as a whole. The division in America might have a different profit and loss layout than the division in the UK, right? So you're not going to get one report that does the whole of the organization. So one of the nice things about this metadata approach is, say, for example, I take the balance sheet, I can copy these lines, paste them, and just change the report to say version 2 of the balance sheet or Bob's kind of balance sheet. And I can completely move all of the items around. I can have different aggregates, different totals, different headings, and I can dynamically switch between them. So different, with the same set of data, I can get a different financial report out. As an example of that, if we look at the balance sheet, so I haven't done that on kind of cash flow, but if we look at the balance sheet, this is the standard kind of balance sheet. This is the first kind of version. So current assets, so that's basically kind of fixed assets, current assets. Then we're subtracting kind of creditors to give us net current assets. Then we're looking at long-term kind of liabilities, subtracting that to give kind of net assets. And we're checking that the net assets equals the total equity. And there's a balance at the bottom to check that it's in sync, right? So assets equals equity in this, right? But some people might say, well, I prefer to look at it like this. I prefer to have all of my assets in one group, and then I'm going to add up all my liabilities and equity and just have that my total assets equals my total liability and equity. So it's the same thing, but it's you know, a quite different way of looking at it, right? And obviously I'm only an implementation consultant. I'm not going to advise what type of layout. It's for their financial team to sort of tell me, and it's for me to implement it. But the good news is, if I do have a customer where they've got two divisions who can't agree, I can give them the same set of data with the same kind of figures, but just a slightly different skin on it, so that it comes out in a different kind of layout for them. So that's one of the advantages of this sort of metadata approach to creating that extra reporting table and those rules. Okay, so that's our cash flow. So hopefully you can see the concept there. I don't know if I highlighted it so you can see that. This final figure is your reconciliation here. Okay. So what we've got is the opening balance plus all of the movement that we've tracked should equal the closing balance, right? And then it's actually taken the closing balance off the balance sheet and it's checked by subtracting that from that to check it comes to null. Just to show you that, I see my closing balance is 34,000. If I go to my balance sheet, I should see my cash is 34,000. Okay. And if I was to bring on my movement and opening balance, I can see what was posted to the balance sheet and the movement of that. My cash gone here. Yes, there's my 5990. So the cash flow is just really a way of really giving a detailed breakdown of what makes up that kind of movement, whereas the kind of balance sheet isn't really going to have that sort of understanding of that. Okay, so that's the mechanics of how we build basically cash flows. And once it's built, what we like to do is to then make this interactive. So we put the visualizations there. We might have drill throughs, so we can right click and get a drill through to say, well, I want to show that by department. I might want to say, well, I want to use something that's a bit kind of newer. Show me analyze my profit that is my EBITDA in some sort of data explorer. So I can say, well, let's look at it in December. Look at maybe by department. So I've got the most profit in the research and development for some reason, break that down by country. So we can start to use the visualization aspects of Power BI to look at the data in different ways. Okay. Now, by far, the most common request that we get, and I guarantee that if you guys are doing financial reporting, you will get the same, is you make this up in Power BI, and who can guess the first question which is going to come out of the mouth of a financial accountant? Right? Can I have it in Excel? Yeah. Can we have it in Excel, right? So what we want to do is to produce with a minimum effort the exact same pro forma layout in Excel so that some people can work in Excel and some can work in Power BI without duplicating any of the data or creating any data silos or anything like that, right? So what we do, let's just park this. Let's take the cash flow as an example. So here's my Power BI cash flow, right? I just take it off screen. I go to the Power BI web experience and I can analyze in Excel and I get an empty starter spreadsheet that is connecting to the model in the cloud. Okay. Once I'm there, I can recreate the cash flow in a couple of clicks of the mouse because all the hierarchies and everything are already defined. So just to show you this, I drag cash flow amount, show me that on the values. I want to go to my financial, well, I probably want to select a date, right? So let's select the fiscal year. I want to go to the financial report, to the financial report dimension. And I want to put the report hierarchy on the rows. And I want to select which report I'm interested in. So I'm interested in the fiscal year of, we're doing 2011. And the report I want is the cash flow report, please. And then from there, I can just expand out that hierarchy. So I can use the tools in Excel to hand out that hierarchy. So I don't know how many clicks of the mouse that was. I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4. There's about 6 or 7 clicks of the mouse, right? And then what you'll find is if I hover over there, that's the, hold on, I'm looking at December and I'm looking at the whole thing. Hold on, I'll just drag one extra filter to get the exact same date criteria on, right? Let's drag December on as well, right? Or even kind of better, because it's in Excel, what they're probably going to want to do is some sort of dimensional analytics, like I want to put all the months on the columns and do a time series by. So we just take December's here, right? Let's filter it to December. There you go. Now let's look at the Power BI report that we made up for. And what you should see is that is almost identical, right? There's one mistake that I made that I see is I didn't put a sort order on the report section. So see how depreciation is at the top here, and it's the second line here, yeah? That's just a mistake that I made when I put the section. I didn't put the sort order on the Power BI kind of model, so it's just coming out in a alphabetical order or kind of a natural order. But I could kind of fix that and get the exact same format with everything. But you can see all the headings are the exact same order, all the numbers, all the totals are exactly the same. Okay, so half my users will want to work in this world, right? And you know, if they want to do that, that's fine. And then other users might prefer to work in the more visual world, where we can also have sort of analytics drilled through, cost filtering and so forth, you know, kind of, but I can support both types of users from the same financial model, basically. Okay, that's that there. Yeah, so that's what we just went through, empowering users in Excel to do the exact same as they can in Power BI in Excel as well. Okay, so that's a quick run through of how we make the sort of cash flow. I'll open it up for questions, but just before I do that, one thing I've got at the end of this deck is there's links to a lot of the aspects of that, like using the many-to-many for financial reportings, how to use the many-to-many for running sum, why you just can't report off the native chart of accounts, some of the DAX patterns, and so forth, how to deal with kind of ragged hierarchy. So all of the challenges that I've mentioned here, I've actually got blogs on kind of most of them, or there's links to some, I think the Italians, if you do have a parent-child, have got some of the DAX patterns, which are good articles, have those as well. So there are further links that you can read a bit more if you want to dig into it. Okay, I'll open that up. Anyone have any comments or questions? I want to kind of dive into any of that. It all looks incredibly easy, right?
Yeah, I really like this metadata approach. I was saying on the chat, I've tried this with the cash flow, just using switch statements for the whole thing to say, well, if it's this line, do this. If it's this line, take it from here. But I like the metadata one, because as you say, you can then have different layouts and much more flexibility, I think, with it.
Yeah. Just the one thing I found is I couldn't do the full hard-coded metadata for the cash flow because of the fact that half of the data comes from the profit and loss and half comes from the balance sheet.
Yeah, that's why I just did it. I just did it using switch statements, whatever. So that's really neat. What about kind of adjustments? I'm just thinking, how would you kind of incorporate those into there if you wanted to add those in? And I guess how you get them in is a different point, but
yes. So with adjustments, there's going to be an account code for adjustments that they're actually posted into, right? So it's just registered into the metadata. So say, for example, you wanted a line for adjustments, right? What you would do is you'd actually add a line on your report with adjustments, yeah? And then it's whether the adjustments come from inside or outside of the finance package, right? If the adjustments are just in the general ledger as an account code, like they're actually posted into an account code, it's the same as everything else. It's just a sum and it's a line, right? Sometimes we have customers that have corrupted ERPs, right? So what this means is in their actual ERP, there's like 100 grand basically missing, right? And they need to post that as an adjustment to get the report to marry up. So what they'll do is they'll have an ancillary table that's not part of the general ledger. So what we basically do is we have an operator to say, hey, rather than summing from the general ledger, sum from this exceptional item kind of table. Yeah,
I've seen that. Definitely seen that before.
So those are the two techniques that we'd use to deal with adjustments. You know, if you could have.
You've got a question as well. So if the accounting team wants to add a reporting line, say between the P&L between lines 17 and 18, do you need to reorder the report number after 17? And also cash flow mapping? So
I can't tell you how many hours I've spent debating and arguing this exact point, right? If you look at the metadata on screen, right, you've got a report number which is just incrementing, right? Say, for example, someone says, right, I want to have something in the middle here, right? I could insert, we've got a filter on, right? Second top. Then you don't, with this design pattern, you don't need to, you can put 112 here, right? The report number is just a unique number. The line number, if you want to sort, see when it sorts the report, it reports by the heading number. So the line number isn't that important. So you could have this as line number 22, fine, right? You'd only get unstuck if you wanted to sort the sections exactly, because then you would have to reorder them then. So yeah, that's a bit of a problem. Now, in some systems, you see this link line number here. I'll just highlight it on screen. What we've done is rather than put the line number, we put the name of the report section in. But then we found that people started changing the spelling of the report lines, right? So you either identify it by the report kind of number or by the name at the moment. Both can get you in hot water if you're not careful. So what we have to do is make sure that any updates to this kind of metadata are very careful, basically.
Yeah. So the links you put on the blog, do they contain this exact example, or is it?
I think there's a recent blog that contains that example. Yeah, there's a good thing from Fernando, which is basically padding. So that's something that we do in one kind of system, is kind of rather than, start 17, start at 170, so that you can add a 171. Originally, we had customers who would try and they'd go, right, it's definitely 1718, and then they come back and go, hey, I've now got 17A, and we'll be, oh my god, that's not going to sort correctly, So yeah, padding, as Fernando says, will kind of help a lot, because it at least allow you to have 9 kind of changes per thing. You could pad with sort of 2 numbers. I mean, it's just an integer value, so 4 digits wouldn't really matter at all,
Sure. Actually, there's a question asking for the link to the SQL Bits video. I couldn't see them actually on SQL Bits when I couldn't find my one on SQL Bits either. I don't know if they're there yet.
I don't think that SQL Bits have published their videos yet. I think they said they were going to publish them, or didn't they? Because Will sent in recordings, right?
Yeah, I can't seem to see the recording. I mean, they did. I got an email saying the SQL Bits videos are up, but have you got that session anywhere else yet, or?
No. I'm doing this session as the profit and loss one. I'm doing it at SQL Saturday in a couple of weeks. But again, I don't know if they're going to record it. So yeah, I'm quite happy to come back and do the more basic profit and loss and balance sheet one again. But there is a recording of it, which will hopefully. So maybe when it's published I might ping the lads at Bits, and if it's available, I'll drop you the link, and you can maybe forward it to everyone.
Yeah. I will do. Yeah, I'll definitely put it up on the mail and stuff as well. So I've got my one on SQL Bits as well, actually. And again, I can't see the video for it. So once I get that up, I'll send that around as well. So I did one on kind of designing a data model. You saw it, didn't you? Designing a data model for finance. So I think that's quite interesting as well, potentially, for thinking about how to work with that data and get it into a shape that works.
Okay. Yes. That was super interesting. Oh. What I will do is I'll drop into the chat. I had a link somewhere. Hold on.
What I should do, there's a question. I don't know if this has been answered. It probably has, but how would this be handled if the account codes are not nicely sorted? So if 1120 to 1200 are all sales accounts, that's kind of what you were showed, isn't it? Account code from.
Yeah. So this is is exactly what happens, right? Is exactly the same as IP addresses, right? The kind of network guy says, right, between 1 and 100 is going to be all the servers in this room, and then someone in another room grabs one of the IP addresses, right? And it's the exact same. Accountants would say, well, this range is going to be cells, and then someone grabs one of the account codes, and it's not cells. So then, as BI guys, we're told, well, it's all of those numbers except for that one, right?
Yeah.
So what we do to get around that is we just do multiple ranges, right? So if you look at this account range rules table here, a classic thing is administration, right? Administration was supposed to be 6,000 to 6,700, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
But what actually happened is there were breaks, because you see 6,401 isn't an administration code.
Yeah.
So what we do is we split them into logical groups. So say, for example, we had between 1 and 10, and someone said, well, except for 5. Well, what do is we go, well, between 1 and 4, and then between 6 and 10.
Yeah.
So we break it down, you know, kind of like that.
Yeah, that works. I mean, yeah, I think it depends on your structure of your kind of GL as well, if it is mapping to particular account codes.
Yeah.
I think the example that I had was where it was just, you know, you had against in your account codes hierarchy, you just had a name against the financial statement line that it came against. So, you know, expenses or, you know, assets or things like that, and then you can obviously just look at it and say sum all of the ones that have that account line.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you've got a bit more of a complicated or detailed GL code structure like here, then this works really well. If you've got a really simple one, then I guess you could just sum it by category.
Yeah. You could skip the GL code completely, and maybe there might be a category in there, but usually we end up having to use these from and to ranges, because you'd think it'd be nicely structured, but there's so many ifs and buts that they end up having to give us these ranges. But I guess it purely depends on the type of project that you work on. You know, kind of maybe I'm just unlucky, and that's how I've had it. You know.
No, sure. Yeah, I think I've kept my community examples a lot simpler than real life, where this is a bit more realistic, I guess, in terms of kind of structure you'd have. So thanks for sharing that.
Okay, great.
Do you have any other questions? We've got a few thanks that everyone's liking the session.
Excellent.
Can't see any others. Anyone?
Okay, great. So I've dropped the link there. If you want to get in and sort of dissect it, you're kind of welcome to.
Yeah, I think that'd be really useful. I'll download it as well. I'll put another link to it as well, so people have that link and could go in. I think that is really the best way to get familiar with this, is actually just try an example yourself and dissect those formulas, and, you know, even try building them out, new ones yourself. So try and create the cash flow statement again from scratch yourself, using those DAX formulas yourself on this example, and then when you come to do it at work, you'll know exactly what to do.
Yeah.
Hi,
Great.
I've got a question.
Sure.
Hi, I thought I'd say it rather than write it, because it's sort of a bit complicated. A couple of years back, we had a finance system, which was expenses and project codes, and they needed to go into a HR system, but the hierarchies were different. So, and it was just trying to sort of match them. So it was a very long Excel spreadsheet process of mapping them. Would this be the sort of way that you could do it? So some of the expense codes were like level 6, and some were level 4 that it started at as the top level.
Yeah, absolutely. So what you could do is you basically, with this type of approach, you're kind of mapping the report down to the lowest level. So once you've got it at the lower level, you can have multiple higher level hierarchies. But where you get unstuck is if you've mapped it out at a higher level and another report wants it at a lower level because there's no linkage, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
I ended up doing it at the lowest level and then going back up.
yeah,
but it was just
so that's
very painful.
Exactly what you do is, yeah, you've got to unfortunately link it at the lowest level first. Now, hopefully, if you can extract the rules, sometimes what I do is I infer the rules. So, say for example, I've got a category, right, and that's my starting point. I'll go to the reports and say, well, what is the min and the max code in that sort of category, and can I use the range, right? So I'll kind of generate the mappings by using a query. I won't actually hand kind of do it. I'll ask kind of someone to fill out a massive spreadsheet kind of template. I'll get the system to try and query the data itself. But once you've got that kind of lowest level, which on screen would be this account range rules table here, you can then from your report have all of the higher level hierarchies, right? That kind of roll that up.
Yeah, that looks, it was just sort of like looking through that, and I was thinking it was such a painful exercise between HR and finance of, it's finance data, but it needed to be in the HR system. So it was, yeah,
that is a problem. So, but unfortunately, one of the big problems is just getting to the point where you can agree on the definition of each line on the report, as to what does that actually mean, in terms of which account codes, and in some, like, I've hidden a lot of the complexities because some of our customers have even more wackier rules. So, say for example, you have trade sales here, right? You could have a rule that says, well, is this account codes, right? But if it's cost center 999, it's not included in that. Cost center 999 is included somewhere else.
It sounds like the project I was on.
Yeah. So I've simplified it by only looking at the chart of accounts, but some customers make their profit and loss balance by using stuff other than the chart of accounts. They basically use the company and the cost center to also drive the rules on the line items. And that makes it a lot messier, but that can happen.
This is a really great presentation. Thanks very much. Really great session.
Okay, that's great. Thanks a million, guys. Folks, cheers.
Cool. Thanks so much, Bob. Really appreciate you taking the time for that.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.